And the purpose of the IMBS is to bring together the muscle power of mathematics along with to resolve and analyze some of those pressing difficult problems that crop up in the behavioral and social sciences. One of the powerful tools, mathematical tools, to understand the social and behavioral sciences is game theory. And what happens is, for example, it is the mathematical study of interactions among people. For example, it might be where your spouse asks you if you remember to take out the garbage this morning. Or it could be something such as that writer's strike that's going on up the hill in Hollywood. Might mean the different groups that are three different main groups in Iraq trying to find some sort of accord. It might mean questions such as the evolution of cancer, such as Steve Frank in the back of the room there has been analyzing. It might be issues such as social norms. Several people here, Simon Levin, Ken Binmore, Brian Stearns, and several others. So really the field of game theory came into being in 1944 with the classic Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by John von Neumann and Oscar Nordenson. Then a major center for the development of game theory that we learned all the history of it at lunch today was at Rand. It was as far away as you could get from Washington on the pier of Santa Monica, as we learned from Lloyd Shapley earlier today. The next big book in this area, and I forgot to bring mine along, but the next big book in this area was the book written in 1957 by Luce and Rayfeld. Many people, what they do is they claim that indeed that this is the first readable book in the area. It still is having a huge impact 50 years later. What happened is I did a search, a Google search, and immediately up jumped 80,000 notations. I checked one of them. It was a young assistant professor at Columbia University, and she wrote, "I love the Luce and Rayfeld book. A funny thing is, it describes various unsolved problems with the implication that, in a few years after the book was written, all game theory would be cleaned up." It's not, folks. It's nowhere near. But actually, I think this book represents the high water mark of the idea of game theory as an all-encompassing tool in the social sciences. And indeed it is. So how did this conference come about? Well, we had this conference for the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis that Simon Levin chaired, the NRC committee. And it was held over there at the Beckman Center. Discovered that Howard Rayfeld was the first director of YASA. Howard was there, as was Tom. And we discovered that Duncan Luce hadn't seen Howard in many years, so we invited Duncan to come. So Duncan and Howard were busily trying to get caught up. Somebody came over to me and said, "Who are those two distinguished gentlemen over there talking up a storm?" And I said, "Well, that's Luce and Rayfeld, the book, Luce and Rayfeld. Never mind the title of the book. It's Luce and Rayfeld. Everyone knows it as Luce and Rayfeld." I said, "You remember that book? It was written 50 years ago. Oh my." So then what happened is later at a NAS meeting, Bob was and I, and then later Eric Maskin, who will be here as soon as his cab gets him here, started talking about whether the IMBS should put together a conference on Luce and Rayfeld. And as Bob and Eric and I agreed that if we do have a conference, which we do have right now, we should keep the spirit of the original book. Make a critical survey of game theory. Let's find out where game theory is today and where it should be tomorrow. And that is what we'll be discussing over the next 2.5 days. Remember that assistant professor at Columbia? She also wrote Game theory has seen lots of important specific advances since then, but its limitations have become clearer too. One of the topics which we will be discussing here will be the limitations and strengths of game theory. Now, you might want to know, how did this book come about? Well, it just so happens, folks, we have two of the experts on that topic, Duncan Luce and Howard Grapevine, in the audience. And so I would like Duncan to come up and let us know, how did this book come about?
Well, I want to thank you all for being here, and thank John Saari for organizing this conference, and I appreciate the high-ranking people who have considered who are here, including 3 Nobel Prize winners. A very laudatory sign. So I'm delighted to be able to talk a little about it. And let's see if I can make this thing work properly. Okay. In 1950, I got a PhD in applied mathematics, but I really didn't want to work on a weapon system, which is what applied mathematics was heavily at that time. So I, as a graduate student, began searching a little bit in literatures that were that kind of mathematics, and looked at some at economics and some at psychology, and somewhat accidentally I met the social psychologist Leon Festinger, and by him the social psychologist Alex Vavelas, and I began working with Al Perry on some graph theoretic foundations of what could come to be called social networks. And when I got the degree, Vavelas invited me to join his small group project in the MIT Research Lab of Electronics. It seems like an improbable place, but that was an improbable laboratory in many ways. There I got exposed to various things, one of them being Wiener's cybernetics, another was Shannon's theory of information, and I did some self-tutoring in the theory of games and economic behavior. I also encountered a number of even then fairly prominent psychologists, and later very prominent. Blicklighter, who's somewhat a father of the net system. Bill McGill, who ended up being chancellor in San Diego and president of Columbia. Walter Rosenbluth, who ended up being provost at MIT, and John Swets, who is extremely well known, particularly for his work with David Green on signal detection theory. And they, without knowing what they were doing, tutored me a lot in psychology, because I never had a course in psychology. Fairly promptly, Vavelas left. It was the time of the Korean War, and he was called to Washington, and then he ended up going to Stanford. So after 3 years, the Research Lab of Electronics folded the group network lab, simply didn't have suitable leadership, they felt. So I needed a job. And through the network of connections I don't want to go into, Paul Lazarsfeld, a very well-known sociologist at Columbia, invited me to become what was called managing director of the Behavioral Models Project, which is supported by the Office of Naval Research. And that project was the brainchild of a faculty seminar that included Ted Anderson, Clarence Graham, Lazarsfeld, Bob Merton, Ernest Nagel, Howard Grapevine, chair, and Bert Solomon and Bill Vickford. These all for people of great prominence in the second half of the 20th century. We were housed in a brownstone, 19th century brownstone on 118th Street, and our project charge was to produce expository essays on mathematical topics in the behavioral social sciences. The group that was doing a lot of the work included Ernest Adams. These were fairly young people at the time. Adams is a philosopher of science at Berkeley, probably retired. James Coleman, deceased, very prominent sociologist. Sidney Morgenbesser, who was a prominent psychologist, philosopher of science, and me. And in that building was also a man by the name of Fred Clay, who was later the Undersecretary of Defense Policy in the Reagan administration. We agreed on a number of topics to write essays about, three of which appeared in 1960 in a volume edited by Herb Solomon, and three more in one that was edited by me. I took on two writing tasks, nth-person game theory and information theory. Howard took on the task of writing about two-person game theory. By the end of that first year, or the summer of '54, we each had to draft roughly 60 pages, as I recall. I don't have those drafts. They're probably in the archives of Harvard, but I wasn't about to go Harvard. Archives. And we concluded that our two drafts ought to be combined and expanded. And that was, I think, definitely the beginning of Games of Decision. 54-55 was the opening year of the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford, and Latham arranged for me to be there, and I was, according to his model, going to be his lackey, of European style. Fortunately, and I would say very fortunately, the man appointed director from, I think he came from the University of Chicago, Ralph Tyler, overruled that model, and all fellows were, in some sense, equal. At least we could decide what we wanted to work on. My main task, of course, was to further work on the manuscript, which I did, but also I got led into some other problems at that time, one of them being Fechner's problem with people subjected to JNDs, and it was not quite 100 years, well, 5 years shy of 100 from the time he published. Nobody noticed he'd made an error. And I don't know how it was sort of obvious to me that he really wanted to work with functional equations, not with derivatives. But he was a physicist and he loved that kind of analysis. So I studied it. Well, and one thing, this was of some importance. He got the right answer for Weber's law, but no other law would give him the right answer by the route he was taking. And nobody seemed to have realized that. Anyhow, Edwards and I wrote an article on that that appeared in Psych Review. That all really led me then into the functional equation literature, and in particular the important work of Janos Axel, who I guess is not in the book, and there he is. And we didn't meet until the 1960s, and he arranged, which is not at that time the easiest thing to do. He was a citizen of Hungary, to attend one of the summer workshops in mathematical models in the behavioral sciences that was run at Stanford for, I think, close to a decade in kind of Barrow's domains and Pat Suki's domains. Incidentally, a little side issue is I decided that summer to learn to fly. And one of the the early passengers was Yash.
He was taller before.
I'm sorry?
He was taller before.
Now, I didn't fly that fast. Functional equations pervaded my work, and I had a number of collaborative papers, actually a number of them, functional equation experts, including Axel and his student, MV. And I also developed an algebraic version of the J&D problem called semi-orders, appeared in Econometrica, and that led to a fairly substantial literature. And I developed a probability model that became one of the games and decisions. In 55, 56, I went back to Columbia, became an assistant professor, and Howard went to that academic year to the center. And we always have agreed that we probably would never have finished games and decisions if we hadn't had those 2 years apart. Somehow it was more efficient from the point of view of producing the book that we not be able to sit and talk. So we communicated the way one did in that era. Many of you don't know much about it. I mean, cutting and pasting is not an electronic term only. One literally cut and paste and retype, or had retyped. And every time you retype, errors crept in, and it was an incessant battle trying to get a clean, fairly clean copy. And if you wanted any copies, it was, the only way was carbon paper. There were no photographic techniques at that point unless you wanted to spend a lot of money. So I think it was also the case that our being apart probably is partial explanation why I couldn't find in my files any photographs of Howard and me. And the other thing is that neither of us were exactly wealthy at that time, and cameras were a bit expensive. In 56, 57, we were back at Columbia, and we kind of polished the manuscript for a while, and then arranged a contract via the editor at Wiley, Gordon Girardi, whom many of us really revered as an editor. He is the model that Larry Erlbaum has tried to base himself on. Morgenstern and von Neumann, who was then on his deathbed, gave their blessings to the manuscript and came out. And in the fall, I moved to Harvard, and there I completed the ideas in the original choice behavior that came out in 59. And then I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania as a professor of psychology. So that 1950 bet of leaving conventional applied mathematics seemed to have worked out pretty well. There's a picture of what the original book looked like. I thought it was a pretty ugly dust jacket myself, but that's what Wiley somehow wanted. And I think the cover of the original is actually better. I should make a photo of that. Then there's an international version of it. It's actually a little bit cheaper than the domestic version. And I had inside it, I don't have any idea where it came from, this little slip in Japanese that somebody had obviously sent to me. It does say something. And the price in yen was 1,370 yen. After my parents died, I found a copy of Games and Decisions I had dedicated to them, And inside it were a number of things, but one of them was a cartoon from the Saturday Evening Post, and in that, on that cartoon, as you will shortly see, was the price of games and decisions at the time. $8.75. But tell us about your home. $4.50 for it. And you know, you laugh at that kind of a price, but when you think of what salaries were at that point, the price wasn't that low. It was about the same percentage of an assistant professor's salary that a modern book that, you know, is going for $120 is. So it was pretty expensive. I'll quote partially several. I'll let you read the quotes. This was what Oscar Morgenstern said, American Scientist, in 1958. He clearly seemed to like it. Bob Thrall, in Psychometrica in 1960, also seemed to like it, and he made a prediction that would remain for a long time within the text, and to some degree that seems to have been true, much to my surprise. And then in Econometrica, again, a very flattering start, but then at the end, he says he can't conceal the fact that the impact on econometrics work is not very great. And I think some people, I know some people, feel it's changed a whole lot. There's me at that time, and I have no idea who took it, where I was, but it was about 1960. So my conclusions are that my interest got changed and focused on things about psychological attributes and their measurement. And game theory for me was a thing of the past. So I'm in hopes that I'll learn a lot at this conference about what's happened and what will happen. That's supposedly what we're here. Games and Decisions was reissued in '89, and I noticed in the 2007 ad, they said it was one of their 6 bestsellers. Now that doesn't profit me any. I mean, Dover's got a neat scheme, as some of you may or may not know. They pay a flat fee to get the copyright, supposed to go out of print, and then they never report to you how to sell it. This is the nearest they get to a sales report. You can only guess what the numbers are. So, since none of my later books have ever gotten this kind of lavish praise, I think it's got to be due to Howard rather than me. And I'll turn the podium over to him and see what he says. Let me get up this.
Dramatic. Usually after I sit, I have a little shake.
There you go.
I learned a lot from you. So.
Oh, I made up the history there.
I had a colleague, Bob Schlegel, who came back one time from a trip to Greece and told me about the story. Robert Slater told me one time at a meeting, and he wanted to know, someone wanted to know what Lucy Raper was like. Well, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to talk about my life from birth, which was 84 years plus 1 day ago, to the time of great gaming decisions was brought out. Give me the highlights. At age 16 for myself and 15 for that lady down there, I agreed to go to a party with her. And I did that, I made that decision without any analysis. And this was a case where it was poor analysis with a good outcome.
Thank you.
Well, we're now on our 62nd year of marriage, so I guess it's going to last. I grew up in the Bronx, poor boy, and like other poor boys in that area, that had some academic aspirations, I went to City College, the home of a lot of people in our field, including Ken Farrow. And in my 19th year, I had a voluntary induction into the Air Force, and I was supposed to go into the Air Force to go to a special program, meteorology. But for some reason or other, I failed an arithmetic exam, which comprised 20 questions with answers A, B, C, D, E, E. And it was graded with a template, and the template slid 1 and 3 down. So I got 3 out of 20 right by chance. I explained that to the captain in charge of the examinations, and he said he agrees with me, he sympathizes, but the rule is that you can't take this off the record. And that was enough to keep me from the Air Force and put me into the Quartermaster Corps. During the Quartermaster Corps, I had a choice between automobile mechanic and baker. I chose automobile mechanic, and I found myself on a train to bakery school. By that time, my transfer came through to the Air Force, but it was too late for the meteorology program, and they put me through a pre-meteorology program, which turned out that the graduates were no longer needed. They had too many meteorologists, so I ended up in the Air Force into a radar blind landing system program. And I must say, that might have been the most exciting period of my life. I worked in Japan, talking down planes that were coming from Hawaii and Alaska, with no alternate airports. The Soviets would give us meteorological information over Siberia, and there were lots of very close, exciting periods. And I had a choice between staying there and going back to school. I chose going back to school, which was another good decision with a poor analysis. I guess I just didn't want to stay away from this fellow anymore. We did enough planning so that we established a residential requirement in Michigan for reduced tuition. And the GI Bill came through. And I'm a product of that GI Bill, like a lot of my colleagues, even younger than I chose Michigan because they had a program in actuarial mathematics. And I understood that you had to pass 9 actuarial exams to get entry into the society. And I thought that was a reasonable thing to do. Michigan was the school that purported to give most relevant training for that program. I took the first 3 actuarial exams, I passed them royally, and I decided that this was not for me. It was much too sort of rigorously structured field with not enough freedom. So I decided to take another year to get a master's degree. I got a bachelor's degree after 1 year in Michigan. I got credit for some of the work I did in the Army. Estelle was going to teacher's training, and she had another year. So, all right, another year, I'll take statistics. Unfortunately, statistics at the University of Michigan was taught by some very good statisticians, but nothing theoretical, nothing problematic. I don't think the word Bayes or subjective probabilities ever got into the curriculum in that 1 year that I was there. While I was taking the course in a master's degree in statistics, which is I didn't think it was a very good degree, I took a course for pure mathematicians in the foundations of mathematics, taught by the R.L. Moore method of teaching. I don't know whether you know this, but R.L. Moore was a topologist at the University of Texas, and he believed it should occupy the students as if they were real mathematicians. The first day, the teacher gave us an assignment and said, think about this and come back with some of your ideas. Came back the next day and said, anybody have any ideas? And nobody had any ideas. He says, class dismissed. The next day, the same thing happened, and some hands went up, including my own. And to my delight, I found out that I had some natural talent in mathematics, which I knew I had some talent in arithmetic, but I had some natural talent in mathematics, and they moved me into taking a doctorate. This was in 47, 48 academic year. In order to make ends meet even better than we had through the GI Bill, I took a job working for the Office of Naval Research, which was on a joint project between the mathematics department and the engineering school. And my first assignment was something looking at submarines, how to find them and how to hide them. And that was some fun, but I got more and more interested in the theory of games. Read sections of like Louis Morgenstern. I didn't have the temperament to go through the thing fully. And I decided to write a report on what I thought was an interesting topic. It was on the general two-person non-zero-sum game. I have some slides that I wrote out. I'm afraid to use them because they're not in the order that I was going to talk about. I put them down just in case I needed them. I'll see how far I can go. I identified two problems, part A and part B. Part A I worked on, it was exciting, but it led, but I considered nowhere. Because I wanted to go ahead and extend the notion of the solution of the two-person zero-sum game to the non-zero-sum area, and at least carve out a set of problems that would have an amenable, nice solution. In the two-person zero-sum game, given the game matrix, all you need to do is to supply the return for one player. The other player, one player tries to maximize that return, the other player tries to minimize that return. That's why it's called zero-sum. The theorem said that there, for every set of any particular zero-sum game, you could find a value V, and the maximizing player can guarantee himself at least V. The minimizing player can guarantee the player will get the most V. If the strategy is so identified would be in equilibrium, there was no tendency for one party to move the other one held fixed. There was a question of uniqueness of equilibria, and if equilibria occurred, they would come in multiplicities so that each equilibrium would have the same equivalent value, and they would be interchangeable, but boiled down to there was no bad story for the multiplicity of equilibrium. When we went over to the non-zero sum game, I did what I think a lot of you probably in my age, I know Tom did something like this, but they're all qualitatively different kinds of line matrix games. I remember hearing you talking about something like that, Tom. And I identified a few games, and nothing seemed to work out well, but there was one property that I liked, and that was the property of dominance. If one strategy dominated the other, there was no excuse to taking the other. You ended up by choice of dominant strategies. But the trouble is that a lot of games did have a dominant strategy. Then I thought of such things as iterative dominance. If Duncan is playing Tom, and Duncan doesn't know what to do because there's no dominating strategy, he said, well, what will Tom do? And if Duncan notices that Tom has a strategy that is dominant in Tom's payoff, Duncan figures that Tom is going to restrict himself to the dominant strategies, therefore he gets best against those, and we get the idea of iterative dominance. Well, that led me to say, well, there's a partial victory. I can think about a class of games where it's worthwhile saying something. Dominance played a prominent role. Then I was a little shaken up. Shaken up for one reason. I can manipulate some of the, well, let me see if I can show you this. Here's the situation of the game where the column player, can you see it? Am I in the way? A column player and a row player. The column player has two strategies, left and right. The row player has two strategies, up and down. And if I put in some numbers, 4, 5, and the red is the payoff to the red row player. The blue is the payoff to the column player. How do I do this? Okay. Good. Who's the coach? You are? Eric? All right, Roger's going to do this. Here's an example where, let's see, the red player would like to move downward here and upward there, so the red player doesn't have any dominating strategy. The red player can see that the blue player, oh, let's see, go back. The blue player would prefer right to left against the upper, and prefer, no, this is what I want to go back.
Main 3. Right there.
Right there, right? The blue player wants to go across this way, the red player wants to go this way and that way, so the red player doesn't have any dominating strategy, but the blue player should play red against, right against whatever the red player plays. And the red player, figuring out the right player, will go one way, the red player can choose. Well, anyway, forget about that. Nothing really profound. There's a case here where there are two equilibriums. 10-6 is an equilibrium. No player chooses to move if the other one holds fixed. 12-8 is in equilibrium. And now I say, oh my God, there are two equilibria, but one dominates the other because the 12-8 is better than the 10-6. Oh, well, maybe there's some sort of rationality there. At least we could say amongst the equilibria, let's look at the dominance, joint dominance, and we see that the 12-8 jointly dominates 10-6, and you can make a prediction that a smart row player would choose down and a smart column player would choose left. So far, so good. Oh, let me come back here. Now, before, the first time in game 4, I had the number here 3. And all we needed about 3 is less than 6. That was the big issue. But I changed this to minus 100. We have an identical structure. And now I say, my God, if I were the row player, what would I do? I don't think the column player is going to be so nonchalant about choosing left. Because if the column player chooses left, he may end up with minus 100. So we now put a seed of doubt. And with that seed of doubt, the row player says, I don't think he's going to play left, and he's going to play right, and therefore I'm better off with 10 versus 5, and I should take up. And then this argument becomes cyclic, and it undermines the analysis. Well, I chose to get some students from different classes and play the game, and I was one of the first ones informally to use empirical game kind of laboratory results. And let's see, do we have this? All right. It turned out that if you looked at this, 61% of the students took the right rather than the left, and no, I'm doing it wrong.
One more left.
One more left?
Right there. There you go.
Thank you. Well, I looked at this and I found out that 61%, oh, this thing moves here. Oh, I hate that. That's why I need an external mouse, getting away from the pad. But anyway, I was shaken to the core. I realized that even the limited domain of problems that I wanted to single out for a solution in some sense did turn out to be working as a matter of fact. And then I decided that what I could do is change the orientation and do some what I didn't call it descriptive prescriptive analysis, but that's what it was. And I looked at the problem from the point of view of one player and say, if I can't get a nice theory about this, maybe what I should do is to try to do descriptive analysis of how people play and then figure out what's best against that. So it was a descriptive prescriptive. It made use of judgmental probabilities. I didn't know the word judgmental probabilities. I didn't know the word subjective probabilities. I used probabilities being natural, but I essentially did some analysis in that chapter on that problem. The next problem that I looked at was this famous problem, now known as the prisoner's dilemma problem. The prisoner's dilemma problem was so dubbed by Tucker in 1953. When I played around with this game, it was 1949, and I called it the wheat farmer's problem. Each wheat farmer was better off having full production, regardless of what the others did. But if everybody had full production, the prices went down and they did poorly. And what bothered me about this game was that clearly, and looking at dominance, 10 is better than 5, and -2 is better than -5. So the red player is better off cooperating. The red player is better off defecting, and the color player is better off defecting. So two defective players doing the wise thing get -2, and so two smart players end to get up -2, two dumb players get 5. And that rubbed me the wrong way. I said something has got to go here. And then I repeated the game and ran experiments. This was 1949, 1950. I ran experiments playing this game an indefinite number of times. And I found out that once again, it was very hard to get a theory of what people would do. But the attitude was, how should you play the game given the actual behavior of others in playing the game? So it was again a prescriptive, descriptive orientation. I finished that chapter, wrote it, showed it to a few people, but decided to do nothing with it because it was all negative. From my point of view, it didn't enable me to go ahead and branch out and get a new class of problems that I could say this is the solution to this problem. It depended upon the vagaries of knowledgeable people. I thought there was information to be had by actually experimentation. And if this game, for example, was played 20 times and both players knew it, the 20th time, smart people would defect, get -2. But it was clear what they would do on the 20th time by iterative dominance. That's what they should do at the 19th time. And going back by iterative dominance, that's what they should do at the first. But people didn't do that. Smart people didn't do that. I didn't do that. I would defect 15, 16, 17. And what to me was important was that you had to make a probability distribution of what the other parties would do in order to figure out what you should do. That seemed to be one of the conclusions about this class of games. That led me into a position of somewhat despondency. My first big theoretical paper just didn't pay out. And it was at that time that I heard a lecture by William Haber, a famous mediator, arbitrator. And he talked about mediating and arbitrating disputes. And I got an aha in the audience. I said, well, why don't I do that? If I can't resolve these problems, why don't I go ahead and say, if two of my friends were involved in a problem like that, and they came over to me and said, Howard, what do you think is a fair solution? What would you do? What would I do? So I then looked at the problem of fair arbitration. And I worked out certain principles, came out with some solutions to this, and it turned out later that Nash had a different rationale, but he came out with, I think, a better solution than I on this. But we were in the same ballpark of how might someone like myself decide what to do. That part of the paper I was more proud of. I made that the central theme of the paper and submitted it in 1952 to Econometrica. It was published in 1953. In the interim, I gave a talk at Princeton at the invitation of Tucker. Nash was in the audience. It was a clear opportunity for me to join him in a joint presentation. But I was taken aside by one of my buddies and said, Nash is a nice guy, but you can't go there and do anything collaborative. It's just not all there all the time. So, this is my introduction to game theory as a doctoral student in mathematics. The statistics department was part of the mathematics department. Part of the statistics group was part of the mathematics department at the University of Michigan. And they had a seminar looking at the work of Abraham Wall on statistical decision theory. A good many of the analytical proofs that he used arguments from game theory on supporting hyperplanes. And I love that stuff, and I was able to follow it. the statisticians had difficult trouble, so I gave a short course to the statistical seminar on Wall's statistical decision theory. And once again, I enjoyed that. But nowhere was, even though Bayes' solutions came up using subjective probability, from Wall's point of view, they came up not with subjective probability, but with probability functions. And he used that to get theorems called complete class theorems. I don't want to bore you with. But he came very, very close to the subjective point of view, but he wouldn't bite the bullet. And he was aware of it, and he did it purposefully, but that's where he came out. Wall, who was a brilliant mathematician, statistician, died in an air crash accident over India. And Wolfowitz, one of his main academic colleagues, left Columbia along with a fellow by the name of Keeper, and they went to, I think it was Cornell. And Columbia was left with a bunch of doctoral students doing work in statistical decision theory and environmental. The other members of the faculty were very good in statistics: Henry Chaffee, Herb Robbins, Anderson, Levine, Solomon. It was a very good department. But none of them were interested in the statistical decision. They needed somebody to teach that stuff. I was the person that did the most about that at Michigan, and I was offered a position at Columbia. I taught an advanced course in statistical decision theory with what I call just-in-time learning. I would learn the stuff the night before, and teach it the next day. And there was people thought I was very good on spontaneity. I guess I did a pretty good job. I had a nervous time with doing it, but I lasted through it. While I was at Michigan, I had to go back. There was a seminar that was promoted by people in the math department and the psychology department, mainly Clyde Coombs, interested in measurement theory. And after I had this problem with this report that I told you about, some of the faculty members who read the report said, "Gee whiz, Howard, why don't you use this report as your doctoral dissertation?" And I said, "I could." And they said, "Sure, this would be fine." And that's exactly what I did. So I was on the job market before I wrote my thesis in my own mind. And the easiest thing for me to do was to take a position at Michigan as part of a new seminar on mathematics and the social sciences. Pardon? Columbia. No, this is at Michigan. So I'm going back. I was given the task to be the rapporteur of all the speakers, and I had to write about what they said and what they could have said and what they should have said. So I was encouraged to go on and speculate. And I did that week after week, and it was a good, very, very good training program. I learned how to write mathematics fast, and I suppose this stood us in good stead with that work with Duncan. I tried to learn how to write mathematics by emulating two authors that I thought was exceptional. One was Feller in his Introduction to Probability, and the other one was Paul Harmos on measure theory. And both of them I thought were models, and I actually trained myself into writing mathematics quickly and coherently. At Columbia, there was a tradition that with departmental work, there was research to be done, there was clerical work to be done. The clerical work devolved to the junior member of the group. So when we started the behavioral models project, you notice Duncan put up all of the influential names, Lazarsfeld, a whole group of them. And then you said Howard Wright the chair. And I was the lonely assistant professor because the lonely position had the eminent role of being the chair of that department. So what I want to get across is that I was somewhat prepared for the exercise that Duncan and I went through. I was prepared in the sense that I had unpublished results for my thesis. They were published in engineering reports, but not in econometric or any of the large periodicals. So I had, there was no question of priority. And I came to our task having written or notes in my library of some of the topics that we were through. The critical aspect was, in my mind, was that there was no way of coming to a conclusion in zero-sum games. Not zero-sum games. There was no comparable position. I guess a lot of people do that, but I learned it through my own active involvement. And I would like to go ahead and say, since writing games in the cities, I worked in lots of fields surrounding game theory. Notably, in the last few years, I've worked in problems of negotiation. I think that the problems are intertwined, and there should be a super approach to this domain. I think that the field is ripe for a new science called decision science, which would involve descriptive, normative, and prescriptive analyses of how decisions are made, should be made, could be made by individuals, by groups of individuals, by individuals working together as teams, by groups of individuals working as a cohesive group, by people getting together and negotiating, by thinking about what are the organizational structures that would promote good decision making, that would look at suggestions made by people interested in good decision making and see how they would fare in a laboratory. Now the empirical work of game theory is almost dominated by the people that are purely interested in descriptive decisions. That area is important, should be part of the broader domain of decision science, but I hope that in the next few days I can talk a little further about how to map out that new vision. That's it. So that's from birth to games in the city.